October 1942. Station 105, Chelveston Airfield, England. The surgical tent filled with another wounded navigator as Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow bent over the operating table, his hands working to remove fragments of German flak from the young man's chest cavity. The metal shards had torn through his leather jacket as easily as paper through cloth. Grow's mind recorded what his eyes had seen dozens of times before in recent weeks. The trajectory was low velocity. The wound pattern suggested the fragments had already lost most of their energy before impact. If only there had been something, anything, between this young man's skin and the exploding shell fragment outside his bomber. Through the surgical tent, Grow could hear another B-17 landing, engines coughing after crossing the channel from another daylight raid into the heart of Hitler's Reich. In the distance, more ambulances approached. The mathematics were becoming unbearable. Nearly 70% of the casualties streaming through his field hospital shared the same wound characteristic. Slower-moving missiles, flak fragments that tumbled through the air after anti-aircraft shells burst around American bombers at 20,000 feet. Pieces of the aircraft itself, torn loose by explosions and transformed into deadly projectiles inside the cramped fuselages. The young navigator would survive. Others that day would not. As the surgeon stepped away from the operating table, he made a decision that would alter the mathematics of aerial warfare. These wounds were preventable. The technology to prevent them already had existed for centuries. Someone just needed to ask the right question in the right place. Within months, that question would save the first of what would eventually become thousands of lives. The collapse of unprotected bomber crews had begun on August 17, 1942, when the 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 flying fortresses crossed the English Channel to attack the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led 12 bombers against the primary target, while 6 others flew a diversion mission. All aircraft returned safely, but the relatively light opposition near the French coast would prove deceptive. As the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German-controlled territory through autumn and winter of 1942, the casualty statistics began telling a grim story that contradicted every assumption about daylight precision bombing. October 1942 brought the first comprehensive analysis of 8th Air Force combat casualties. Medical officers compiled data from every wounded airman who passed through British hospitals. The numbers revealed a pattern that stunned military planners who had expected the primary threat to be German fighter aircraft and their machine guns. Instead, the analysis showed that approximately 70% of all bomber crew wounds resulted from relatively low-velocity projectiles. Not bullets from Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt 109s, but fragments of exploding anti-aircraft shells and pieces of the bombers themselves torn loose by flak bursts. The flak environment over occupied Europe was unlike anything American air planners had anticipated. German anti-aircraft batteries, called Flugabwehrkanone, or flak, had been developed and refined during years of combat. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe had positioned thousands of guns around strategic targets. The standard 88mm flak gun could fire shells to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. Each shell carried a time delay fuse designed to detonate at a predetermined altitude, transforming the shell casing into hundreds of razor-sharp fragments traveling at lethal velocities. Colonel Grow understood the medical implications immediately. The October analysis revealed that torso wounds constituted the majority of fatal injuries. Chest wounds accounted for 36% of fatalities among unarmored crews, while abdominal wounds added another 39%. Combined, wounds to the body core represented 75% of all deaths among bomber crews. The mathematics were straightforward: protect the torso, reduce fatalities. But the solution was not obvious. The United States Army Air Forces had no body armor program in 1942. The concept of personal armor had fallen out of military favor during World War I, when experiments with steel vests proved the weight was prohibitive for infantry soldiers who needed mobility more than protection. Aviation warfare presented different parameters. Bomber crews were already encumbered by oxygen equipment, parachutes, and heavy flying suits. They operated in confined spaces where mobility mattered less than survival. Most critically, they faced a specific threat profile dominated by slower-moving fragments rather than high-velocity bullets. Grow's surgical training gave him insight that military planners lacked. He understood wound ballistics. A fragment from a flak shell after traveling 200 yards from the explosion point to the aircraft had lost most of its initial velocity. Such projectiles, traveling perhaps 500 to 1,000 feet per second, could be stopped by relatively thin steel plate. The same principle applied to fragments of aircraft structure torn loose by explosions. These were not armor-piercing bullets travelling 3,000 feet per second. These were tumbling pieces of metal that had already expended much of their kinetic energy. In October 1942, Grow submitted a proposal to 8th Air Force Headquarters, requesting authorization to develop personal armor for bomber crews. The proposal cited the casualty analysis and included preliminary sketches of a vest incorporating overlapping steel plates sewn into fabric. The design was inspired by historical armor, particularly medieval brigandine armor, which used the same principle of small overlapping plates to provide flexibility while maintaining protection. The initial response from Air Force leadership was skepticism. Weight was the immediate concern. Bomber crews already carried approximately 40 pounds of equipment, including parachutes, oxygen systems, and flying suits. Adding substantial armor seemed impractical. There were also concerns about cost, production capacity, and whether crews would actually wear the equipment in combat. Some officers argued that improving fighter escort capability would be more effective than providing armor. Grow persisted. He proposed a limited field test, produce a small quantity of armor vests, issue them to crews, track the casualty statistics compared to unarmored crews, let the data prove the concept. Headquarters authorized the experiment with one critical condition. The armor had to be developed quickly and manufactured outside normal military supply channels. The Army Air Forces lacked the capacity to produce armor domestically on short notice. Grow contacted the British for assistance. The Royal Air Force had experimented with body armor for their own bomber crews, but had encountered obstacles. British bombers, particularly the Avro Lancaster, which formed the backbone of RAF Bomber Command, had extremely cramped crew positions. The confined spaces made bulky armor impractical. RAF armor experiments had been abandoned by late 1942 as unworkable for their aircraft configurations. However, American bombers offered more interior space. The B-17 and B-24, while certainly cramped by any civilian standard, provided slightly more room than the Lancaster. What didn't work for the RAF might work for the Americans. The British connected Grow with the Wilkinson Sword Company, a firm with a curious pedigree for wartime armour development. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had built its reputation manufacturing swords, bayonets, and later razors. But the company maintained expertise in metallurgy and had a long history of armour work dating back to the Victorian era, when they produced bulletproof vests for British officers serving in colonial conflicts. During World War I, Wilkinson had manufactured body armour for officers, though the weight made it unpopular. By World War II, the company had shifted most production to aircraft fire suppression systems, but they retained the technical knowledge to work with armour plate. Grow travelled to Wilkinson's facility in October 1942 with his preliminary designs and medical data. The collaboration that followed represented an unusual partnership between military medicine and civilian manufacturing. Grow brought his understanding of wound ballistics and human anatomy. Wilkinson contributed expertise in metalworking and production engineering. Together, they refined the design through multiple iterations, each one balancing protection, weight, and flexibility. The final design consisted of 3 separate pieces. The main vest covered the torso front and back. A separate apron piece protected the lower abdomen and groin. An additional piece could be configured to protect specific crew positions like the ball turret gunner who faced unique threat angles. Each section incorporated 2-inch square plates of manganese steel, each plate approximately 1 mm thick. The plates overlapped slightly, sewn into pockets within a heavy canvas outer shell backed with soft cotton for comfort. The critical innovation was the manganese steel selection. This alloy provided hardness sufficient to stop or deflect reduced velocity fragments while remaining thin enough to keep weight manageable. Each steel square weighed only a few ounces, but collectively they provided coverage for the torso's vital areas. The complete vest and apron combination weighed approximately 22 pounds, substantial but not prohibitive given the lives at stake. The design included a quick-release mechanism consisting of coloured cords and fasteners. Pulling the red ripcord would instantly jettison the entire armour system, addressing concerns about crews needing to bail out or escape damaged aircraft quickly. By early 1943, Wilkinson had produced prototype armour suits for testing. Testing began in March 1943, with crews receiving the British-manufactured vests. The early missions with armour showed promising results. Wounded crew members began appearing at field hospitals wearing damaged armour vests that had stopped fragments. Medical officers examined the vests and found flak fragments embedded in steel plates, stopped before penetrating completely. The fragments had lost enough energy travelling from the flak burst to the aircraft that the thin manganese steel was sufficient to defeat them. By spring 1943, demand for the armour suits was beginning to grow. Word spread through 8th Air Force bases across England. The British production capacity through Wilkinson Sword could not meet expanding demand. The company's facilities were already committed to other war production priorities. They could produce perhaps 100 armour suits per month, far short of the thousands needed to equip the expanding 8th Air Force bomber fleet. In summer 1943, Colonel Grau worked to arrange domestic production. The War Department authorised immediate production of American-manufactured armour. The contract was unusual in that it involved collaboration between military arsenals and civilian manufacturers, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The museum's armour workshop, staffed by medieval armour experts and skilled craftsmen, became the primary design research facility. These specialists studied historical armour designs, particularly 15th century brigandine armour, and adapted the principles to modern materials and manufacturing techniques. Stephen Grandsay, curator of the Metropolitan Museum's Arms and Armour Department, led the research effort. His 1945 article in the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin described the process. The design of Armour Vest M6, which is the latest standardised flyer's armour, is based on one of the museum's brigandines dating from about 1400. The suits of armour in the exhibition halls are constantly studied for suggestions, and no type which seems to hold the slightest promise of adaptation is overlooked. Heavy armour for the military sport of jousting, lighter battle armour, shirts of mail, scale armour, and the quilted jackets of Renaissance days have all been carefully examined. The collaboration between medieval armour experts and modern military engineers represented one of the most unusual research partnerships of the war. Museum craftsmen, who normally restored priceless historical artefacts, were now designing life-saving equipment for bomber crews. The expertise accumulated over centuries of armour development was suddenly relevant again in an age of aerial warfare. American production began in mid-1943, with multiple facilities producing variations of the basic design. The standardised M1 vest used nylon fabric instead of canvas for the outer shell, a modification that improved water resistance and durability. The cotton backing was retained for comfort. The steel plates remained the same specification developed with Wilkinson Sword. Production rapidly scaled up as manufacturers across the United States began receiving contracts. On October 5, 1943, the M1 Flyer's Vest was officially adopted as standard equipment for all 8th Air Force bomber crews. The authorization memo specified that every combat crew member would be issued armour appropriate to their position in the aircraft. The decision represented a massive logistical undertaking. The 8th Air Force was rapidly expanding in autumn 1943. New bomb groups were arriving in England monthly. Each group required hundreds of armour suits. The M1 vest weighed 17 pounds and 6 ounces, lighter than the British Wilkinson model due to improvements in plate arrangement and fabric selection. Pilots and co-pilots, who sat in armoured seats that protected from below, received a modified M2 vest with less rear coverage. Ball turret gunners received the M3 apron designed for the cramped confines of their position. Waist gunners got the M4 apron optimised for standing positions. Bombardiers, navigators, and other seated personnel received M5 groin armour to supplement the main vest. The modular design allowed crews to configure protection based on their specific threat exposure. Initial resistance to wearing the armour evaporated quickly once crews experienced it in combat. By early 1944, the armour programme had expanded to include additional protective equipment. The M3 helmet, developed specifically for bomber crews, provided better shrapnel protection than standard infantry helmets. The helmet used overlapping strips of manganese steel over a leather-flying helmet base. The Grow helmet, named after its inventor, featured 5 overlapping steel strips that could stop fragments that would penetrate standard helmet designs. A comprehensive study conducted by 8th Air Force medical officers examined casualty rates comparing armoured versus unarmoured crews. The study, documented in official Army Medical Department histories, examined 1,117 battle casualties from heavy bombardment groups. Among crews not wearing body armour, fatalities from chest wounds were 36% and abdominal wounds 39%. Among armoured crews, these dropped to 8% and 7% respectively, representing a 77.1% reduction in thoracic wound fatalities and 82.1% reduction in abdominal wound fatalities. Additional analysis showed a reduction of 58% in individuals wounded and 60% in total wounds sustained among bomber crews after armour introduction. The armour could not prevent all deaths. Head wounds remained lethal regardless of torso protection. Limb wounds continued to cause casualties. Fragments striking at extreme angles could sometimes penetrate through gaps. Direct hits from larger caliber projectiles could defeat the thin steel plates. But the armour succeeded at its primary mission by stopping the majority of slower-moving fragments that constituted the primary threat to bomber crews. October 14, 1943, brought the mission that would become known as Black Thursday. The second raid on Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories saw 291 B-17 bombers dispatched. 60 bombers were lost, 17 more damaged beyond repair, and 121 returned with battle damage. The losses were devastating, representing over 20% of the attacking force. Medical officers examining returning crews found that armour had prevented many additional casualties. Crew members displayed damaged vests with fragments embedded in steel plates. Without armour, the casualty toll would have been even higher. But the armour could not overcome the fundamental challenges of daylight strategic bombing in 1943. Even with protection, crews faced overwhelming odds during the darkest months of the air war. The turning point for bomber operations came not from armour alone, but from fighter escort. The introduction of P-51 Mustangs with enough range to escort bombers deep into Germany changed the tactical balance. Long-range fighters could engage German interceptors before they reached the bomber formations. The combination of better fighter escort and body armour created a synergy that improved survival rates dramatically by spring 1944. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the 8th Air Force had become a mature fighting force. Thousands of aircraft conducted precision strikes against French transportation networks and German defences. The armour programme had equipped virtually all bomber crews. Production had overcome initial shortages. By war's end, 338,780 M1 vests had been produced, along with 95,919 M2 vests. One of the most remarkable aspects of the armour programme was how quickly it was implemented once the need was recognised. From Colonel Grove's initial analysis in October 1942 to full-scale production by late 1943 took just 1 year. This timeline included design development, prototype testing, contractor selection, production ramp-up, and distribution logistics. The programme also represented effective Allied cooperation. The British provided initial production capacity through Wilkinson Sword. British metallurgists contributed expertise in steel alloys. The UK supplied 9,600 flak jackets to the USAAF under reverse Lend-Lease. American manufacturers scaled up production using British designs as a foundation. The Metropolitan Museum of Art provided design research that improved the American versions. The collaboration crossed organisational boundaries in ways that were uncommon even in wartime. Colonel Malcolm Grow continued his innovations throughout the war. Beyond body armour, he developed better oxygen systems that reduced hypoxia at high altitudes. He pioneered rest homes where combat-stressed crews could recover between missions. He instituted psychiatric screening and support programs that reduced combat fatigue breakdowns. His holistic approach to crew health addressed physical and mental challenges simultaneously. In July 1943, Colonel Grow received the Legion of Merit for developing body armour to protect combat crews. The citation noted that a study of wounds showed nearly 70% were caused by missiles of relatively low velocity, and that he led the way in developing light body armour and steel helmet that saved many lives and materially improved combat crew morale. In May 1944, General Grow was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for developing a device to protect gunners from wind blast, electrically heated clothing, gloves, boots, hand warmers and casualty bags for wounded, wind and fire-resistant face and neck protectors, and a special combat ration for use on long bombing missions. Frostbite cases decreased and flight efficiency increased. After a study of psychiatric failures in combat, he helped institute rest homes, a new special pass system, and special training for medical officers in tactical units. After the war, Grow was appointed acting air surgeon for the Army Air Forces in 1945 and air surgeon in 1946. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the medical service initially remained with the Army. On July 1, 1949, Malcolm Grow became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force, serving until November 30, 1949. He retired as a Major General on December 1, 1949. He died on October 20, 1960, at the age of 72, having lived to see the full flowering of the body armour programme he initiated. The lessons learned from the World War II armour programme influenced Korean War equipment development. The M1952 vest, issued to ground troops in Korea, used ballistic nylon instead of steel plates, but followed the same modular design principles. Vietnam-era flak jackets incorporated improved materials, but retained the basic concept of flexible armour, providing protection against fragments. Modern body armor with ceramic plates and Kevlar fabric represents technological advancement, but follows the same fundamental approach that Colonel Grow pioneered in 1942. The legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grow's innovation extends into the present day. Every police officer wearing a bulletproof vest, every soldier equipped with body armor, every person whose life has been protected by flexible armor technology owes a debt to the Flak Vest program of World War II. Modern body armor has evolved technologically far beyond the M1 Flyer's vest, but the conceptual foundation remains unchanged. Today's ceramic plates and Kevlar fabric are more effective than manganese steel squares sewn into canvas, but they serve the same function by providing protection against fragments and projectiles that would otherwise kill or wound. The story of how one surgeon's development of steel vests saved thousands of lives contains no dramatic battlefield heroics. There are no last stands or impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Instead, it's a story of careful observation, data analysis, creative problem solving, and bureaucratic persistence. Colonel Grow saw patterns in the wounds he treated. He connected those patterns to a solution drawn from history. He collaborated with unlikely partners to develop and test that solution. He advocated for adoption despite skepticism. He succeeded because the evidence was undeniable and the need was desperate. The Flak Vest program demonstrated that technology can save lives even in the most lethal environments if the right problems are identified and addressed systematically. Protection doesn't require perfect invulnerability. It requires adequate protection against the most common threats to reduce casualties to acceptable levels. The M1 Flyer's vest couldn't stop everything, but it didn't need to. It needed to stop most fragments most of the time, and that's exactly what it did. The combined bomber offensive exacted a terrible toll. By war's end, the 8th and 15th Air Forces together suffered over 27,000 killed in action and another 9,000 wounded in action. RAF Bomber Command lost over 55,000 men, killed with approximately 18,000 wounded. The scale of the losses underscored the importance of any measure that could improve survival rates. Body armor represented one of the most effective life-saving initiatives of the entire air war, with documented casualty reductions of 60% overall and over 77% for fatal torso wounds. The bomber crews who flew through flak-filled skies over Germany in 1944 had dramatically better odds of survival than those who flew the same missions in 1942. Better fighters helped, improved tactics helped. But body armor helped more than most people realize because it addressed the most common cause of casualties. Thousands of airmen survived their combat tours and returned home because one surgeon insisted that their wounds were preventable and worked tirelessly to prove it. The Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Andrews Air Force Base is named in his honor, ensuring that future generations of Air Force medical personnel will remember the surgeon who pioneered modern body armor. His innovations in aviation medicine extended far beyond the flak vest. He developed windblast protection for gunners, electrically heated clothing that reduced frostbite, improved oxygen systems, psychiatric support programs, and rest facilities for combat-stressed airmen. Each innovation addressed a specific problem identified through systematic analysis of medical data. The Metropolitan Museum of Art created exhibits in subsequent decades, showing the connection between medieval brigandine armor and modern flak vests. The exhibits displayed a 15th century brigandine alongside an M1 Flyer's vest, demonstrating how the principle of small, layered plates had been adapted from ancient armor to modern materials. Museum curators noted that warfare's eternal challenge of protecting soldiers had found new solutions through creative application of historical knowledge. The Wilkinson Sword Company resumed civilian production after the war, returning to razors and garden tools. But the company retained pride in its wartime contribution to the Flak Vest program. Company histories published in subsequent decades devoted significant space to the collaboration with Colonel Grow and the development of protective equipment that saved thousands of American lives. The story of the flak vest development contains lessons that remain relevant decades later. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. A surgical officer, not a procurement specialist, identified the problem and proposed the solution. A sword manufacturer, not an armor company, provided initial production capacity. A fine arts museum, not a military research lab, supplied critical design expertise. The program succeeded because it drew on diverse sources of knowledge and capability. The program also demonstrated the value of data-driven decision-making. Colonel Grow's initial proposal rested on solid medical statistics. Testing provided clear evidence of effectiveness. Expansion to full production was justified by casualty reductions in units using armor. At every stage, decisions were based on evidence rather than assumption. This rigorous approach overcame skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the program showed that lives could be saved through protective technology even in lethal environments. The conventional wisdom in 1942 held that bomber operations over Germany were simply going to be bloody. High casualties were assumed to be inevitable. Colonel Grow rejected this fatalism. He believed that better protection could reduce casualties even if it couldn't eliminate them entirely. His belief, backed by medical evidence and engineering expertise, proved correct. The flak vest stands as one of the most successful rapid military innovations of World War II. From problem identification in October 1942 to full implementation by late 1943 represents an exceptionally fast timeline for a program that required new equipment design, testing, contract negotiation, production scaling, and distribution logistics. The success resulted from clear evidence of need, practical solution design, effective collaboration between military and civilian entities, and unwavering support from Air Force leadership, who recognized that protecting crews was essential to sustaining the bombing campaign. In the annals of military medicine, Colonel Malcolm Grow's development of body armor for bomber crews represents a triumph of systematic observation and evidence-based innovation. He saw patterns in the casualties he treated, identified a preventable cause, designed a practical solution, proved its effectiveness through testing, and persevered until it became standard equipment. His work established principles that continue protecting military personnel and law enforcement officers today. The fundamental concept remains unchanged. Identify the threat, design appropriate protection, balance weight against effectiveness, test in actual conditions, and issue as standard equipment. The mathematics of aerial warfare were altered fundamentally by the introduction of body armor. Before armor, approximately 36% of crews struck by fragments to the chest died. After armor, that mortality rate dropped to 8%. The improvement in survivability changed bomber crew psychology, tactics, and ultimately contributed to the outcome of the air campaign. Crews who believed they had a reasonable chance of surviving their tours flew with more confidence. Commanders could plan more aggressive missions, knowing that crew loss rates were manageable. The story serves as a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that bureaucratic systems can be navigated when the stakes are clear, that collaboration across boundaries produces better results than isolated efforts, and that data-driven decisions lead to better outcomes than assumptions. Most importantly, it reminds us that individuals can make differences that echo through generations. One surgeon, working with a sword company and a museum, created a solution that saved thousands of lives and changed how militaries think about protecting their people. In their transformation from concept to reality lay not just the salvation of individual airmen, but the validation of a principle that remains vital today, that careful observation, creative thinking, and persistent advocacy can overcome even the most daunting challenges when lives hang in the balance. That is the enduring legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grow's Flak Vest program, a testament to what one determined individual can accomplish when armed with data, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who serve.